Since we're in the month of October, and it had been a little while since I covered an Agatha Christie adaptation, there's really only one perfect option to review, and that is Halloween Party, the second episode of Season 12 of Agatha Christie's Poirot. I read the novel for the first time shortly before watching it, and I realized that this was the first time I've read one of Agatha Christie's novels from the 60s. When I was first getting into her work years ago, I spent most of my time reading the books from the 30s and 40s. So I'm very familiar with her style and the time period from those books. And even now, having read Sad Cypress just before starting Halloween Party, the difference was almost shocking. In going from 1940 to 1969, you can really feel the change in her writing. The dialogue feels less formal, if that makes sense. Poirot was called in much earlier on in comparison to books like Murder in Mesopotamia or Sad Cypress again, and the mentions of long-haired pop singers, LSD, and rebellious young people firmly place us in the decade of change that was the 60s. And then plopping the old world sensibilities of Hercule Poirot into this story gives it all a different dimension that other contemporary stories would lack. I really enjoyed the book though. It's a very dark story involving the murder of a child, but it also has such a well-defined sense of atmosphere, in several sections in particular. The finale, which I won't discuss, is rather sordid, but ties things up pretty well. So going into the adaptation, I was ready for the time shift back to the 1930s, as the series never really strayed from that period, save for the occasional flashback. Similar to the shock of going from a 1940s book to this one, there was also a change going from Season 9 and Five Little Pigs to Season 12, which aired in 2010, but not necessarily in the way I first expected. From watching the occasional later episode years ago, I remembered the pervasive soft focus and gauzy look to the visuals of this show. That is present here, but not to the extent that I'd feared. The most positive surprise I had was in the performance of David Suchet, whereas in Five Little Pigs and Sad Cypress, where he had one notable comedic moment per episode in otherwise somber stories and more muted performances, here he's downright animated and feels much more like the earlier version of this character that I love. The score also contributes to that tone, with many insertions of the Poirot theme to liven things up. But at the same time, this is the token spooky episode, and the tone is balanced between that of a darker, scary story and the lighter tone that fits this series so well. There are many scenes set at night, with Dutch angles, fog, and shadows galore. There are some creepy masks that appear during the titular party, and especially during the finale, which is a nice addition compared to the old man disguise of the book. The score also has an unsettling, recurring theme of children whisper singing, snap, snap, dragon. All of this builds a great Halloween atmosphere, but doesn't go so far as to tip over into the realm of real horror. I believe this is the first time that I've seen Ariadne Oliver make an appearance in this series, and I like Zoe Wanamaker in the part. She brings the Agatha Christie surrogate to life very well, and I enjoyed the moments of her expressing frustration with her own work. Somewhat strangely though, she's saddled with a cold, which keeps her out of the way much of the time. Whether that was done to limit the amount of filming time needed with her, or if there was an actual creative reason why Ariadne Oliver was left out of the events, I'm not sure. For the rest of the characters, it's somewhat of a mixed bag. Amelia Bullmore as Mrs. Butler was very good, and Deborah Findlay as Mrs. Drake was fine, even if both women seemed far older than I pictured them to be. Sophie Thompson is quite good as well as Mrs. Reynolds. The Reverend character is expanded a good deal in comparison to what we saw in the book, and I'm not sure I understand the reason for it. There's a heavy emphasis put on his being a money-grubbing skinflint, and at this point, am I the only one that finds it tiresome to put Christian characters in a hypocritical light? Not necessarily for this series, but across the board, in films and television. Maybe let's try fitting in some Christians that actually take their faith seriously, just to shake things up. There are a couple of characters added, those being the adult children of Mrs. Drake, played by Ian Hallard and Georgia King. Georgia King plays the daughter as the stereotypical spoiled rich girl, and Ian Hallard goes way over the top as the caricatured, effete son, Edmund. What these two added, I'm not sure, other than to throw in at least one more potential suspect. Mary Higgins was good as young Miranda Butler, but again seemed older than I read her as. And for another thing, she lacked the chemistry with Poirot that is shown in the book. On one hand, they spend a lot less time together on screen, but what there was felt somewhat distant. Paola Dionissati, hope I'm saying that right, is excellent as Mrs. Goodbody. The the village gossip that replaces Superintendent Spence's sister as the fount of all knowledge of local murders. I think everyone has met someone like her. The older woman that has a whole world of schemes and secrets locked away in her mind and has dirt on everyone around, and her Mrs. Goodbody embodies that completely. David Suchet plays off of her beautifully, stroking her ego and trying to sift through the rambled thoughts to get at whatever useful information she might have. But now we come to my biggest issue with the cast. Julian Ryan Tutt as Michael Garfield. This character from the book is one of my favorites, due to his mysterious nature, his charm, but also his disdain for the less artistic around him. And Julian Ryan Tutt instead goes for pure arrogance and becomes a standard, villainous bohemian type. The interesting dynamic that he shares with Poirot in the book is touched on, but it's not fleshed out enough to really make the same impact here. And his hair, his costumes, and his exaggerated facial expressions felt far too theatrical for the character. The passion for creating beautiful gardens is also skimmed over. Michael Garfield here seems to do it because that's what was written for him to do, rather than stemming from any real love of it, a love he believes no one else can really share. There is another element which, if you've watched my review of Five Little Pigs, you'll know I won't be a fan of here either. That being a rumored relationship between the church organist and a local school teacher who died prior to the film's events. This time, though, the rumor does have some basis in the book, that being a single line of dialogue. Here, of course, it's expanded as Poirot again must listen to someone lament how they can't live the way they want to. And yet again, unsurprisingly, it has no bearing on the story we're watching, other than to set up having the organist stand sadly by the water where a second dead body is found later. I find all this extremely unnecessary, and when so many other things from the book are left out of the adaptation, it's so predictable that this one line is taken and added to. To be clear, I would not prefer it expanded into something that actually affects the story, but here it's just, oh, how sad for her. Anyway, back to the mystery. There are other changes made, most of which I wasn't that keen on. There's another character murdered later by way of drowning in a lake, where in the book it's achieved by drowning someone in a puddle on the road. That's not a huge deal to me, but I think the book's method feels more original and even more sinister, somehow. This adaptation also doesn't do a great job of establishing Leopold's habit of blackmailing people. There's the bit with the new watch, but having Poirot leap from that to blackmail, especially considering that he doesn't know how recently Leopold came into all this money, was too much of a leap for me. And finally, having Poirot reveal the identity of Miranda's father in front of her doesn't seem like something Poirot would do. Poirot is very careful to protect young people throughout the books, whether that be a young couple he's trying to match up or little Miranda that takes him by the hand and leads him through the garden. So having him deliver such shocking news with her present, rather than just acknowledging to her mother that he knows the truth, felt out of character. Since there is a change from a body's location, though, from a wishing well to elsewhere in a garden, I thought the macabre line regarding a body being used for compost was a nice hint early on. And I very much enjoyed Poirot framing his great reveal at the end as a scary story, complete with the cliché line, "It was a dark and stormy night." The final element that didn't quite match the heights that the book achieved were the scenes set in the garden. The novel establishes this serene, beautiful, and mysterious atmosphere that hangs over the quarry garden so perfectly. It's where Poirot stumbles across Miranda and Michael Garfield for the first time, and those interactions in this almost magical place were my absolute favorite sections of the book. The location that was chosen for the film doesn't quite do it justice. It's an interesting location, to be sure, with plenty of sculpted shrubbery, but it doesn't quite give me the sense of wonder that the book builds in your mind. Halloween Party is the episode that I've been most torn on since I've started doing these reviews. On one hand, it's got a fantastic performance from David Suchet and gives him opportunities to play against a variety of character types. The score is wonderful and it delivers an overall fun, Halloween-infused taste of our favorite Belgian's detection skills. But at the same time, there are plenty of disappointing changes made, and the cast doesn't quite click in the way the best of these stories can. It was fun jumping ahead to a later episode to sample one before continuing on through Season 9, though. I should mention, I watched Sad Cypress a while back, and ended up not reviewing it. It was a fine episode, and gave me a huge laugh when Poirot disgustedly samples a couple of varieties of fish paste, but otherwise I didn't have a lot to say about it. I probably won't be reviewing every episode as I go along, but I'm happy to report that these first 3 I've watched have not been the huge disappointments I was leery of before leaving the comforts of the first 8 seasons. For quite a while, this was the only adaptation of Halloween Party, until our old friend, Kenneth Branagh, decided to adapt it for himself, in this year's A Haunting in Venice. I've not seen it yet, but as soon as it hits physical media, I fully intend to. The trailers were interesting, but I'll reserve any firm judgments until I actually see the movie. For now, I will say, if he's given the opportunity to continue this series and continues to change the filmmaking style based on the story, I'm all for it. My hope is for a spy action thriller take on the Big Four, but that's just me. Thanks very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this, I hope you'll check back to Hildebrand Productions for more. Thanks again, and adios for now.